Hello, and thank you for joining me. I am Bree Pappin from the Special Collections and Museum Services Department here at the Pueblo City County Library District. We are coming to you from Rawlings Library today, and I'm very excited to share another series with you in conjunction with the exhibit that is both online and here at Rawlings Branch on the 4th floor in the Info Zone. It is Pueblo and the Roaring Twenties, a decade of boom to bust. And also in conjunction with the 100th anniversary of the Great Pueblo Flood. And I'm excited to bring you this series of 2 architectural talks that examine the building of pre- and post-flood Pueblo with architectural historian Wade Broadhead. Wade is a city planner and staff of the Historic Preservation Commission for the city of Pueblo. Wade has a degree from Western State College in Gunnison. And Wade is a National Preservation Trainer for the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, NAPC, and conducts trainings for cities across the U.S. Most recently, Wade was the planning director for the city of Florence, Colorado, where he helped establish their first city commission and historic context study. So enjoy part 1 of our look at architecture just before the Pueblo flood from the very late 19th century, the 1880s, 1890s, to just up to the flood on the eve of 1921. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Wade Broadhead. I'm the city planner and historic preservation staff for the city of Pueblo. Today we're going to be talking about architectural history during the 1921 Pueblo flood. We're here at the Arkansas River levee to look at the skyline of the city of Pueblo. And what you see behind me is remarkably similar in a lot of ways to the skyline that it was in 1921. In 1921, Pueblo had just minted its downtown. A lot of the buildings that we think of as the most famous historic buildings in downtown Pueblo had just been finished within the last 10 years, and this existing skyline of Union Avenue in South Pueblo was already formed. And it's that city that the flood washed over in 1921. It was a city in architecture in a style of transition. There was a number of transitions that were happening architecturally with methods of construction, as well as socio and politically. And that area is the area we're going to go and look at today. And we're going to talk about the different styles of architecture and the impact that the flood had on the buildings that we lost, as well as most of the buildings that we saved, but it had a major impact. And that we see those buildings and those photos that we look at of the flood. And we're going to talk a little bit about where those buildings came from and their architectural history and a little bit of their social history, and tie that into the story of the flood. Like I said before, the flood had washed over this period of this downtown of Pueblo that was incredibly fascinating. It was a town that had started in the Victorian era with the orange sandstone that we'll go look at, Manitou sandstone, and kind of this very grandiose Victorian architecture that we had downtown, which was quickly nipped after a depression and replaced with progressive era kind of white brick and beige brick buildings that were kind of exemplifying the classical revival style of architecture. And so we had these kind of 2 different cities that were meeting downtown, and that was the city that of all this architectural diversity that the flood washed over. All right, before websites, there was only really one way to advertise your city as well as your business, and that was with your architecture. So you saw very amazing, beautiful architecture during the Victorian period, and really it was an advertisement for the town. As people came into Pueblo at the train station, this was their first view and first perception of the town. And so in the 1880s, 1890s, we were competing with Denver, with Colorado Springs, all over the West. And so the architecture was a way for us to tell our story, and that we were an established town, that we were just like a Chicago or New York or someplace back east. And so they spared no expense with this beautiful Manitou sandstone, Richardsonian Romanesque train depot. It would have been one of the nicest in the state, really in the United States, in the Western United States at the time it was built. And so the water here would have been like 13 to 15 feet tall. And there's a number of pictures of all sorts of debris floating down and smacking into the building. Luckily, the building survived. In one of the strangest turn of events, they actually had to drop the tower 20 feet, which I don't even know how they did that. was an incredible feat of engineering to drop the tower because the weight had actually changed. The weight load had changed because of the flood. And so this building would have been a really good example of the kind of 1880s, the early style of architecture. And this would have been the second building wave that would have hit Pueblo. There was an early kind of turn of the century 1870s building wave. And that's more of what you think of as kind of the Wild West. And so we would have had dirt streets at that time. There would have been cowboys around. You would have actually Native Americans and the Utes would have been not too far away. And so that we were already in the second building boom. We'd already started taking down some of those early hotels, some of those early buildings. And by 1900, we were starting to pave the streets. And so this period is that Victorian period that we think of kind of a high style Western United States expansion period. The railroad had just gotten here a couple of years ago. And so, this would have been a beautiful, one of the most beautiful buildings around. And there really wouldn't have been much other than this kind of downtown and a couple of buildings and small neighborhoods outside of here. But this would have been the commercial hub of the city. Everybody would have come through this. There was no airports. So everybody, all the business people, all the new immigrants working at the steel mill would have come through this period and would disseminate it out into the neighborhoods. And they would have gotten into other buildings, the big, beautiful buildings downtown that were split level and they were kind of dual use and they were commercial downstairs. And a lot of them were, they were transient residences upstairs. And so a lot of the buildings would have been transient residences upstairs. And so people would have hot cotted, they would have rented rooms by the hour or sometimes, by the week or the day. And they would look for work and look for a more permanent place to live. All right, we're across the street now looking at the Arcadia Building. And after the Victorian era, Union Depot, which had lots of arches, very ornamental architecture, looks like something from like a Gothic, horror story kind of a building or a haunted house. Things transitioned right after that into the late 1800s, early 1900s, and buildings started to get a lot more muted. And so you saw some of the pieces of the Victorian era, and then you started to see some of the elements of the progressive movement and kind of the neoclassical movement. And Pueblo is an incredible place that you can see a lot of these transitional buildings have been lost in other cities and are here. And so the late 1890s and early 1900s is this incredible example of some Victorian elements and some progressive era elements and a lot of muted styles. You don't see a lot of these arches anymore, these ornamental battlements and things like that. You start to see things that are influenced by Rome and Greece and the classical world. And you start to see dental molding and you start to see simple building design elements, but you also still see some of the Victorian elements. And so behind us, we have very simple windows. The brick is still kind of an orange brick now. And then it's got dental molding up at the top of the building. And then it's got an electrified sign. And so we forget that electricity was relatively new, so that would have been a big deal to have an electrified sign in the early 1900s and late 1800s. You have Agengar molding up at the top, but a lot of the building still feels like it could fit into like a Victorian area downtown. And so this is a really good example of kind of simple, muted, transitional, like neoclassical buildings. We see a lot of these in Pueblo. And I always say like this is like our brief spark. We had a huge influx of capital from the steel mill in the 1890s, and the town just kind of blew up. There's a lot of construction in the early 1900s. Hi, we're here in front of the Holmes Hardware Building. This is a good example of kind of another transitional architectural style that you find in Union Avenue. This is the kind of the heart of the Union Avenue Historic District now. We're just down the street from the Union Depot, and this would have been, again, ground zero during the flood. A lot of the most famous pictures are taken with this building in the background. It would have been, it's got a really interesting architectural style because it was half commercial building and it was half industrial building. It was served at the rear by the railroad tracks that were back there. And so back in the day, this would have been the neighborhood Home Depot. This would have been the neighborhood Lowe's. You would have come here to get all sorts of different things, a lot of hardware, lumber, building supplies, as well as home decor and other things. But this building is a really good example of this transitional style. And so it's got red brick, but it's got paired windows and arches that you see on Victorian architecture. And then at the top, it's got this dental molding cornice that runs around the top of the building. And again, it's kind of a muted style because this would have been, when it was built, sort of had like a very functional, pragmatic purpose. It would have, been loaded by a lot of different heavy lumber and stuff like that. But again, it was still, it was like a commercial for itself. And so it has a nice kind of canted entryway to the street. And it's kind of interesting that, building loads right next to where the bridge goes up, so it would have a very interesting location. And it's got rosettes on the very muted pillars that it has. That are very evocative of Greek and Roman architecture. But the other building kind of feels like maybe a simplified version of a Victorian building. It's got the loading dock, and so this is one of my favorite buildings in Pueblo. It's got a mix of the Victorian progressive era, it's commercial, it's industrial, it's just about to go in a whole other kind of era of significance with a major renovation, and we're going to see a lot more activity here soon. Hi, we're here in the center of the Union Avenue Historic District to talk about some of the effects of the 1921 flood. And behind me you have kind of the core commercial district of the Union Avenue Historic Avenue. And so there's lots of different buildings from the 1880s to the 1920s, but what you see behind me is a bunch of really interesting buildings. There's storefronts during the flood. A lot of the storefronts actually fell off. They weren't engineered really well, and some were actually hit by debris and train cars, and actually the parts of the fronts of the buildings fell off. And so they were restored in the 1920s in the style of the time. It would have been a cheap way to renovate your storefront in some ways. If you would have made it through, you would have updated into the 1920s. Just like now, a brand new business owner comes in. Sometimes they like historic facades. Sometimes they want things to look very current, very modern. So if you look behind, it's very simple, very flat. You've got kind of the windows with eyebrows on them, the 1920s windows, and then you got sign plates for the buildings. And so that's where they actually advertise the business inside, name of the building. And so you have a lot of these kind of 1920 elements and what I think is probably 1890s or early 1900s buildings. So a lot of the earlier buildings were able to be restored, to be able to be fixed up, and some of the buildings weren't able to hold up as well. And so the facades were replaced and repaired in the style of the day. All right, we're here at our last stop on the tour in front of one of my favorite buildings, City Hall. Built in 1918, 1919, it would have been one of the last buildings built before the flood, and definitely one of the last kind of grand style governmental buildings. And I love Pueblo because we're always a little bit late to the architectural cultural game. And so the county had already built their county courthouse. Denver, Colorado Springs had built their classical revival buildings, and we've been working on it for last time, and we just got it in right before the flood. And it has Memorial Hall attached to the back, which is a memorial to World War I soldiers, which we don't even really think about anymore. And when we were constructing and doing the rehab of this building a couple of years ago, we found a lot of the construction photos. A lot of the crews that built this were very diverse groups of people. So there was a lot of Mexican-American immigrants and a lot of different immigrants from around the world who worked on the construction of this building. But this is one of our best, kind of small compared to other cities, classical revival, Beaux-Arts, neoclassical buildings. And so, again, this building is highly influenced by Rome and Greece. It's got fluted columns, it's got laurels, it's got egg and dart molding in places, and it's really just kind of a huge smorgasbord of classical hints and elements that are talking about what this building's purpose is. And at the time, a lot of people wouldn't have been educated, and so this building would have been telling the people, this is the governmental building because it looks like governmental buildings in other places. And really the style is to say, like, this is a very serious building. This is a building where you need to basically straighten your tie up. You need to come dressed up, and it's a very serious building. And so this is where government is going to be held. This is where to make a lot of important decisions about the city. So this building would have been absolutely brand new when the flood hit. It would have been at ground zero, and the river would have been nearby, and it would have been flooded and then had to have been cleaned out. And so this survived the flood, and Memorial Hall survived the flood and went on to be one of the premier locations of entertainment in the city. And so architecturally speaking, there's a lot going on in this building, but it's a lot smaller and a lot more muted than architectural buildings like the Pueblo County Courthouse, as well as buildings in Denver. So we always get a feel of every architectural style in America, but we kind of get a smaller version of it. And Union Avenue is a great architectural zoo, a lot of people call it, or architectural museum. We have a little piece of every architectural style in the Western United States from the 1870s on until the 1980s. And so you get to see a little piece of every architectural style. And this one is a really, really good example of the neoclassical style. But then you can kind of block the time frames from the 1890s all the way on up into the 1920s and later. You get a feel for every single style. So within 4 or 5 blocks, you can get a feel for all of American architectural history and all of our legacy, and like the time it takes